My name's Jessica Goldfinch, and I am an artist, and I also am an arts educator. So I've been here my whole life, so I am a native New Orleanian.
And you said a little while ago when we were talking, you said that you grew up in a commune. So
Yes.
what commune?
I grew up in an urban commune, which was in New Orleans, and my father was very involved in the civil rights movement and was actually in a landmark case that went to the Supreme Court. And so he was already living like kind of an more underground life in a sense. Underground's not the proper word, but trying to live a different kind of life than what was going on. And he and a few friends had decided to try communal living. So they bought a very large house. It's a Queen Anne from the 1880s in uptown New Orleans. And this was at a time where we were having white flight and everybody was moving to the suburbs. And so the house has 18 rooms altogether on it. And I actually still live in the house because my mother bought it out eventually, and it's now apartments, so I have my own apartment in it. But as a child, I was exposed to a lot of different things than most people. People were investigating all sorts of different things, religion, music, art, kind of just different way of living. And I also went to an experimental school, so my exposure to what was a normal life or straight life was not much growing up, except for maybe my grandparents who were actually Baptist missionaries. So that was kind of the other end of the spectrum. And they spent 40 years in South America and Central America converting the heathens. And by that, my grandfather meant the Catholics. That was his joke. Anyway, we ended up in a Catholic city, which is kind of ironic. But yeah, my parents came here both to go to school and stayed. So I'm second generation now.
Excuse me. So I'd like to know a little bit about also your reflections and investigations of religion. Reflection on and investigation of religion. You mentioned a few different perspectives you have with that, and I'd like to know more.
Yeah, I mean, as a child, like I was saying, I was around people who were into different things. I mean, I knew people that went to go live in ashrams, and some of them were quite nutty in my view, even as a child. And on the other spectrum, you know, my father and mother were much more analytical, especially my father. And at a young age, he told us that if we wanted to go see any synagogue, church, whatever, if we were interested, he would bring us to any of it for our own personal investigation. And I never really wanted to go. Although I will say when I travel, I'm very interested in seeing religious sites now. But it is a curiosity and not for spiritual. It's not a spiritual curiosity, but more of a analytical, you know, thinking of how different people live and what they believe. Yeah, I'm curious about that. And, you know, growing up, as I did, I mean, we grew up a total atheist, and actually my father would read, he had a children's Bible, and he would read the stories just as he would read Grimm's fairy tales or anything like that. They were just tales, and morality tales, just like Grimm's fairy tales are. I can remember going to my mother one time and asking her to read it, and her getting like, "Oh, I'm not reading that," and I just was extremely perplexed at, because to me it was just a story, and still is just a story. But, you know, my work, I just became really fascinated with how people believed in those stories and how those stories shape the world. And also, I think, to be an educated person, you have to know about other religions. And so it was part of education too, for me. And, but, really from this outsider perspective and trying to see, what things had in common and the differences, I guess.
So, you're an atheist living in one of the most religious cities, even though it's not Bible Belt religion.
Yeah.
It's a very religious city.
It's a very religious city, yes.
So how does that affect your process and practice?
Well, it's funny because a lot of people have looked at my work and think I'm a Catholic who gave it all up and I'm angry, and which is not at all the case. I will say that as a child I was made fun of by the girls that went to Catholic school, and I can remember Sacred Heart, which is one of the most expensive Catholic schools, and my school started a half an hour later and had no uniform, and walking past and they would taunt me and ask me if I was an orphan. And I remember replying, they were all behind a fence, just telling them, well, you're in the cage. I'm not in a cage. They have to keep you behind bars. I'm out here free, and the look on their faces was just very perplexed. I don't think they could even think about that concept. But I do love some of our rituals and traditions that do come from religion. Mardi Gras just passed, and that's definitely one of them. I think there's a lot of beauty in religion. There's a lot of other stuff too, but there is very beautiful things. I love our cemeteries, whether they're the Jewish ones or the Catholic ones. There's just the architecture of them, and even the way commemorating the person that was, whether it's a simple phrase or these little painted photographs that you can look at under the brass door. There's beauty in that. And I have a want for that beauty, but with more my perspective on things. And I have actually had people come up to me to talk about my work and say, finally, there's work that has my beliefs in there. And so I guess there's not just me that is looking for that.
So I know one of the other roles that you play in New Orleans is also as an art educator. So
Yeah.
Are you going to both denominational and...
No, I work in public schools, and I pretty much keep my work separate as far as the content of my work. I work with elementary and some middle school kids, and I work in on the West Bank, which is a very poor part of the West Bank, and with all different kinds of families, Vietnamese, black, white, and in that white we have Cajun, which is very separate from the Irish descent, right? Very different culture. Hispanic. I really enjoy, working with the different families with that, but I keep that out of it. I will say for a long time, if people would ask about, not the children, but other teachers would ask, if I was doing some religious thing or what church I went to, I just would say I wasn't raised a Christian, and because of my last name, they would assume I was Jewish, not knowing that Goldfinch is not a Jewish name. It just has gold in it, and I would just let it go. And then after a few years, I thought, I'm in the closet. If I were Jewish, I would tell them I was Jewish. If I were Hindu, I would say it. Why am I not saying this? And I started just to say, oh, I'm an atheist, and I think it's important that people know that, atheists are not all, this, what people deem them to be, Satanist, child killing, corrupt, whatever you want to say. It goes back over the centuries. But that actually there's a long tradition of, humanity being, a human thing, I guess, and that in order to dispel those kind of things, you got to meet somebody who's, you know, not what you thought, kind of makes you change your mind. So, and I do it with the getting more honey with flies with honey, thing. And I've never been a proselytizer, and I don't like that in religious people, and I am not that way either as an atheist, and, at least not at work, not a button pusher. And I usually don't talk all that much about it unless I get asked. I don't,
So I'm curious about your take on New Orleans and West Bank education, and I know that there were a lot of changes made post-Katrina. Did that affect the West Bank as well? And just what is your take on
Well, first off, I used to work in Orleans Parish and before the storm. And one of the reasons I started teaching was I wanted to help my community and my neighborhood. And I wanted to give the children a bigger picture to the world instead of just the 4 blocks around them. And when Katrina happened, they illegally fired every single teacher in Orleans Parish. And I believe it was a political tactic to break the union up and to move charter schools in. And really the shock doctrine, which is, when people are in shock, you politically can come in and change things and make a lot of money. And it was really awful. I didn't work for a year. And the charter schools, I work in a specialty program, which is in the gifted program. And our state, a lot of states have academically gifted, which is the high end of special education. And in Louisiana, we have musically gifted, visual arts, and theater. And so in some ways, we're actually, I feel, ahead of other states. And once you're in the program and you have to submit a portfolio and do a state evaluation to get in, then it is your legal right to have these classes, just like if you're need anything special, whether it's the other end of the spectrum where you might need a teacher if you're blind to help you with that or whatever. It's considered part of your right to have a free, appropriate education, which is, that's actually a federal thing, but in Louisiana it falls under that. So the charters did not want to recognize this because it means paying for a specialty teacher. And some schools might have 1 kid, some schools might have a classroom. And they pretty much denied most special education kids their rights, no matter what speciality they had. So they would tell children who were handicapped, we don't have those services here. You must go somewhere else. So I fell into that too. There are lawsuits working their way through their courts where parents of children that needed special education are suing for this. But there's been, my own nephew was dyslexic and pushed out of his school because they didn't even want to test him for it because they didn't want it to be for him to get that paperwork, because once that paperwork was in, then they were going to have to get that teacher for him. And so basically he was not reading and they were ignoring it and we really can't help you with this kind of thing. They gave the runaround. And anyway, Jefferson Parish still was pretty intact. So I ended up getting a job there. And we have a very strong talent art program. And although we had some ripples politically where the Chamber of Commerce put up a lot of money to politically turn the school board to be much further right. And the National Union came in and helped us flip that again. But I think the schools suffered and they started putting charter schools in when that happened. And now and none of those people had ever been in a classroom. They hadn't taught, they hadn't worked in a school. I don't even know if they'd walked in a public school before they were school board members. But now, since we flipped it the other way, it's become a lot better. And just things that I think, putting so many kids in a classroom, you can't teach them. And when you're dealing with lower income kids, I think you need, more one-on-one work. It's just they start later, and they're behind, and you need, for them to catch up, you need more one-on-one interaction. And I think it's just really important. And in my program, I joke that I teach a lot more than art, but I really do. I a lot of times I'm the first person who understands their compulsion to make art, and I find kids that have just stacks of drawings that you can't even pry them out of their hands to kind of screen them to get into the program. I have to bring them to the copy machine and copy them in front of them. They just don't want to lose them. These are little kids. And then I'm the first adult who will talk to them about these kind of ideas that they're having in their artwork. And I believe, my work is very conceptual. It's very object-oriented too, but there's a lot of conceptual background to it, and we talk a lot about those kind of ideas and bigger ideas in there. And even if it's, an anime, a lot of kids start with anime, and a lot of my friends started with drawing Batman, so I just, find it a gateway drawing into other things. And so, we talk about, with anime, Japanese printmaking, for example, is a really, and go into the historical content of where these images came from. And this is Japan, and isn't it an interesting place? Would you ever want to go there? Just to kind of get them out of, like I said, the little neighborhood they grew up with. And I'll ask my students, what do you want to do when you grow up? And I get things like, I think it'd be fun to put stuff on the shelf in Walmart. And I'm like, really? Because you don't think that'd get boring? And then they think about it, well, maybe it would. And well, what else is out there? What could you do? And you get them to dream further. And even if they, don't end up being the astronaut, they might end up working in a field like that if that's their dream. And I think it's really important to plant those seeds at a young age. And so.
What about the talent you're seeing at a young age? I mean, that's to get labeled into a gifted program.
Mm-hmm.
So, I know they say talent will find a way and all that, but what has your experience been?
Well, I find some extremely talented kids that don't need much, much guidance, and then I find some other ones that just have never realized if you put a horizon line in there, it grounds everything and makes a whole difference. So there's some are already doing it, and some need that little, and once you show them that little trick of how to make a 3D box or something, then they take off, and the talent just comes into that. So some of them need a little more than others. But I found this one little girl, and I walk the halls. And I think some of the other teachers, some schools don't, I'm itinerant, so some schools don't know me that well. And I think they think I'm checking up on their teaching skills or something, and I'm some official. But I'm looking at the drawings, and there'll be a group of, 15, 20 drawings, and I'm like, that's the one right there. And I try and look for a name. But I found this little girl, and Hispanic little girl, and she was third grade, and had this dresser drawers where drawers were pulled out, and it was pretty much in full perspective, which is amazing for that age. So I pulled her out of the class and sat her down, and I usually bring some objects, little statuary, like I have a tiki and kind of a Confucius-looking Asian guy, and just to kind of spark a little bit of imagination for them to draw. And she starts kind of drawing, and she's going through my pencil box, and she finds a little thin paintbrush. And she looks at me, she goes, "What is this for?" I said, "Well, it's for painting." And she looks really perplexed. She's like, "It'll take you forever to paint a house with that." And I found out her father was a house painter, and she had never painted. She was recent to the States, and she just didn't realize that people painted pictures. And so I got to be the first one to get her to try paint, and that was really amazing to me, and to her, she loved it. So there's a lot of that kind of thing, and sometimes I will say I have to pull things out of them to get them to talk about their work, but if you've been in my class for a little while, they'll start talking.
So, switching gears just a little bit. You've been in New Orleans your whole life, and you've been an artist for your whole life. So,
Yes.
what have you seen as sort of the changes in art or not in New Orleans? More or less, the art scene, the artists, the compositions, and I'm especially curious, of course, comparing before and after Katrina, but there was also Betsy and Camille and, all the other major disasters.
Well, I felt like when Katrina happened, before Katrina, there was a ceiling for me. And there were a lot of people that were older than,
Explain what you mean.
well, there were a lot of people older than me that had their fingers in everything. And they were the ones that showed in the better galleries. And I think part of it is due to my age, since I'm below the baby boomer age. But I feel like a lot of things were sewn up. And because of my work, it's not, some people, can find it disturbing or, even shocking, whatever, and more in your face. People, I wouldn't get that much of a chance. And I don't do pretty work in the normal sense, although that's a component. I like to pull between the disturbing and the beautiful, and it's, I'm very intrigued with that kind of thing. But a lot of people, I think, just saw the disturbing and couldn't deal and didn't think they could sell it and blah, 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 blah. And there were a lot of, well, I can't sell it, I can't show it. And then Katrina happened. And although a lot of horrible things, of course, happened because of that, and buildings and people that were here my whole life were all of a sudden gone. And that was really hard to deal with. I had friends that had just moved, and I lost them in a sense. They didn't, perish in the storm, but they went and lived in California or wherever, and they weren't there like they were. But on the other hand, as far as the art scene went, all of a sudden there was room to breathe. And that year after Katrina, I made so much art that I couldn't work, I didn't have a job. So I made a lot of work and was able to even engage even more in my work because of it. And then we ended up with outside people coming in who were used to dealing with other art scenes that were just more friendly towards what I did. And then the people that weren't were kind of gone. They were like, oh, New Orleans, I'm never coming back. Of course, they trickled back eventually, most of them, because they realized other cities were not like ours, But during that time, I was able to show a lot more, and I started getting more solo shows and more recognition, and younger people kind of took over and who had different ideas than the older people. And there was a lot more art, because it was art and not just to sell it, going on. And there was also grants that happened, and so it became very different. Although now I think there's a kind of push and pull, because the secret's out and people have realized how wonderful New Orleans can be, and we've had a lot of people move here. And so you have a lot of people coming in, and some of it's great and some of it's not. But there's a lot more jockeying for positions going on now than after, previously after the storm. So.
Do you think artists can make a living in New Orleans now? We were just talking with a musician who was saying, compared to the mid-'80s, a musician now is not going to eke a living out the way he was able, starting here in the 80s.
Well, I tell you, the 80s were the worst poverty I'd ever been through. The 80s were horrible for me, and art and in general. And I look at it as the trickle down that trickle didn't. Here we had the oil bust and all the oil money went out, and we didn't have the tourist stuff really yet, and so that was not a time I could make a living with art, although I just went to school, and I, at that point, started working in the music business, actually, but bringing in punk rock music, and more traditional music might have made money if you were going to play funky stuff. But the stuff I was interested in, we paid our musicians. We had a lot of kids come, and I did a lot of independent promotion and stuff like that. But as arts, I didn't see any real venues to show my work. As far as making a living now goes, it depends on, how you define it. I mean, I feel like all my money comes from art, and I teach, but I'm sharing what I love with younger people, and that's art too. Whereas some people would think, oh, they're teaching, they're not making all their money from art, but everything every penny I make is from my skills as an artist and my views on art, and so I think I am successful in that way. And having another generation coming up behind me and carrying that on, I think is just really important. So
I'd like to talk a little bit more about your art. You mentioned earlier dealing with, or I forget how you phrased it, but thinking about the concept of perfection.
Intelligent design.
And intelligent design.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about your thoughts there and how that's influencing your work? Or
Well,
has influenced your work?
I will say you might have picked up by now that I do think a little bit on the political side of things, and the push, a religious push for intelligent design and those kind of ideas, and entering the political sphere, which really started in the Reagan era. Politics became more religious, and I started thinking, people were, the concept that you just couldn't get, like there had to be a creator, I guess, and started thinking about intelligent, calling it intelligent design and how well designed we are. So I started thinking about the things that weren't well designed in us. And like the example was the throat, and how it's both our air and our food pathway, and how that's not very intelligent because you can choke and die, and trying to figure out how to make pieces that kind of showed that kind of thing. And some of them got lost in just the idea and the concept because they were hard to illustrate. And I would sit and try and take a medical cutaway of the throat and sit and try and find the pathways to separate it out and do it in a realistic way, and it became very hard. But some of it was just depicting it and getting that over to the audience who might view it. But that kind of ran into just scientific ideas of death and mortality, and I've always been just fascinated by medical illustration, and actually found my aunt and uncle had all these old books from the Civil War era, because my uncle's grandfather was a doctor. He was actually a POW. He was a Southerner, and he was in a Northern prison camp for a while. But he, when he got out, came back and became a doctor. So I have all these books, and actually Civil War time is when plastic surgery started, and so I found all these books, 8 or 9, and became very fascinated with them. But I guess I've gotten a little off track here with my other stuff. But anyway, it became, interested. We had spoken about the piece with the multiple arms. I became interested in how to depict religious iconography in a more human way, and what would a goddess look like, what would the bone structure be underneath, and and that came out of these medical illustrations and altering them, and trying to get the anatomy right and how the shoulder blades would work. And if you had your normal shoulder blades, the arms would hang down near your butt, and it just didn't look right, and became kind of weirdly insect looking. So they had to, if you were going to have multiple arms, you'd have to have shorter blades. They're not really a shoulder anymore, but where your arm attaches. And if you didn't have the blade, then the arm just wouldn't move from here. It would just move. You had to have that socket into a shoulder blade, but they had to be shorter so they didn't hang. And it just became this whole kind of investigation of a reinvestigation of how anatomy works and how it would all fit together. But it's just real important that it could be a reality to me and not just a religious idea. So, I don't know.
So we started this project because people were telling me years ago that friends of mine here, that they wanted to speak for themselves about New Orleans, and that they were tired of the hype, tired of the stories. So I'm kind of curious. I always like to offer people the opportunity to say what they want the rest of the world to know about New Orleans. If you're not from here or haven't been here or have only been here for Mardi Gras, what would you want people to know?
That New Orleans is just extremely complex. And even if you grow up here, there's still another layer to that onion to peel that you might not have grown up around. It's so complex, and that it kind of turns a lot of other, thoughts, people grow up thinking on their head, It is just so rich, and I'm still fascinated and in love with it, even though I've been here all my life. But I think the problem comes into when people who are not from here are trying to interpret things, and they're trying to use their paradigm from how they grew up to look at what's going on here, and it's just not going to fit. I think, even things like, a lot of the media tried to portray things like our race relations in this very black and white categories, and tried to put this lens on it where we've got, Creole, and we've got, we have a long history of people that are not black or white, and it doesn't all, fit into those categories in the same way. And we've had black leaders here. We've had more black mayors than New York City has. And we've also, if you go back into history, there were plantation owners who were black and owned, black people, which is people, you tell somebody that and they're like, wait, what? And we also, being under French law, we've had, and not English, like all of our laws are based on French law, that you could be a free person of color here, and we had free people of color here. And I'm not saying at all that there is not problems or racism or anything like that. It's just that it becomes a lot more complex when you have a different history. And I think people moving here don't understand that sometimes with our culture, and they so I think, with that going on, and I think more people need to observe rather than just blatantly, the first thing that comes to mind when they see something, they're not looking at the layers, and how we live together, and I also think we have a lot of people that have come here, and it's kind of like when the person falls in love with the musician on the stage, and they think, oh, isn't that person wonderful, and I just love them. And then they start dating them, and they're like, God, that guy goes out all night, and he drinks too much, and he would just be just perfect if he didn't do that. Oh, and he would be just perfect if, if this little change or that little change, if he didn't, go and to the studio, and I'd rather him here home with me. And New Orleans is like that. They fall in love with New Orleans, and then they want to come in and they want to change it. And I don't mean change like fixing our streets, because we all want some good streets. But, they're like, oh, there's that guy who plays the saxophone, 11 o'clock in my neighborhood. And they get mad at him, and it's like, well, he's been doing that all my life. And I live in a residential uptown neighborhood. They're not talking about French Quarter. And that, I find one of the wonderful things that I don't want to change. And yet people will, move here and then complain about the fact that there's a neighborhood bar 2 blocks away, or that the music's too loud, or, they'll, and they want to change it. And I just feel like, well, there's the rest of the country you could live in that doesn't have those things. Or you can move to the suburbs and just come in when you want those things. But we live with the music and we live with the art, and whether it's somebody who's added an art piece to the wall that wasn't quite legal to do, or a musician who's just walking down, the avenue playing, or, anything like that. I think that they don't, understand it, or don't, I don't know how to put it. But I think that I smile when I like that. That's what makes it richer. Or you might just see somebody wandering around just doing their totally own thing by the way they're dressed and whatever. I think it adds to it, and it puts a smile on my face. And, and there are also, people who come here and I believe are called to New Orleans, and they come once and they're like, oh God, this is where I want to be. And then they add to it, and they add to our pot of, and bring in new little things and learn the traditions. They don't just, criticize or, say, well, this isn't right. They figure out and bring whatever they had creatively to it. So it's kind of, I guess I don't think others should be defining our culture. And then what you were saying about, letting us speak, I think that is part of it. Yeah.
So I usually try to give everyone else the opportunity to ask a question. If you guys have a question. Do you have a question?
I have one.
Yeah.
From your experience kind of educating and mentoring youth, but I know you said you don't, proselytize, or you might not necessarily be out as an atheist, but I, for instance, work with an LGBTQ youth group, and I've noticed that kids, even really young kids, can kind of sniff you out as an other,
Yes.
and use you to kind of come out to you
Yes.
in their way, whatever their closet is they're coming
Right.
out. Have you ever had that experience?
Actually, I had this one boy, he was in 5th grade, and he said, do you go to church on Sunday? And I said, no. And he says, my father doesn't go to church on Sunday either. And then he thought for a second, and he said, why don't you go to church on Sunday? And I said, well, I don't believe in God. And the child looked like he was about to get struck by lightning. And it was just him and I in the class, and he was like, and he stuttered, I didn't think you were going to say that. And I said, well, I'm going to tell you the truth and not lie to you, and that's the truth. And he was like, oh, okay. And then for days, I kind of thought maybe his parents would make a complaint or something like that would happen. And that didn't happen, but my friend who taught him in middle school, I went to go by there one time to pick something up, and he was there, and I saw him, and she said after I left, they had a whole conversation where he brought up, she doesn't believe in God, and they had a big conversation about me and about the concept and all of that, and so it hit him. But he's going to find that if he's seeking something like that out, he's going to find it eventually. And And I am not going to lie to my children about those things. There have been a couple of things I've had to say, you really need to talk to your parent about, which were more like birth control type things, a parent or, Planned Parenthood call or the internet, that, I believe there is that, I shouldn't be dictating that, although giving them options to look for it. I haven't had any kids come out that were gay or transgender or that to me, but there are kids that I really had a feeling probably were, and of course would be open to that conversation. I did have a little girl who pointed out a child and told me that, and this boy that she pointed out was like third grade, and she said that he insisted on being called, it was a female name, I can't remember the name, but he's like, but his real name's Errol, and he insists that he's a girl, but he's Errol. And I just said, I explained to her, some people feel like they're born, inside, they feel like they're different, and they're not born into the, a body that really fits what they view themselves as. And, what does it hurt to call him by a different name or her, if that's what they want? Does it, does it mean anything different? Does it, it's just a name. And she was like, oh, okay. And oddly enough, this girl was with me during testing because her parents were against the Common Core testing and were very religious. And so she was with just me, and she got probably in a point of view that her parents would not have really wanted her to have, in a sense. Although Hannah was she was a pretty logical thinker, and I think she, what I said hit home with her. But I just found it very ironic that her parents were trying to avoid something, and she ended up, learning a bigger picture point of view, I guess. So, yeah.
Other questions?
What do you think is the best way for parents, if they're religious, to give their kids like the most open-minded perspective? Like, do you think that is difficult or impossible, or how would you?
Well, I mean, I have told children myself, I believe this. It's up to you to figure it out. And I kind of think that that's a good way to do it, no matter if you are religious or not. And I do think that religion it's kind of an individual thing, and whatever makes sense to you and whatever makes you feel, if it's spirituality that you're seeking, then, great, seek it. But I like one of the women I work with, she was raised Catholic, and she went to Catholic girls' school and then Catholic college, and she was a teacher like me, and we became good friends. And when Obama was running for president, she said, I like him, but I just don't like the fact that he goes to that Muslim church. And I had to say, Muslims don't go to church. The church is only for Christians, and if it's a church, it's Christian. And Muslims go to a mosque. And she was educated by most standards. She's a teacher, and she had no idea. Like, she was only had that, and she was like, really? And I'm like, yeah, really. You can't, it doesn't, and there's people that go to temple, and there's people, that go to Mormons, I think it's called a stake, and, it just was kind of wild to me that she was, in her late 40s and had no idea about that. So yeah. And I would also, adding to all of this, and this isn't religion, but I think New Orleans has made me view things in a more class-based view. We, especially working out where I do, I work with all different kinds of background children, and they're all, the thing they have in common is poverty. And I think we've all had officials that are in jail, corruption, and they power corrupting. It it doesn't matter to me what race you are. People in power can be corrupted, and the money is what they go after. And but yeah, I don't know.